There is a structural assumption embedded in modern financial behavior that comfort and efficiency can naturally lead to stability. Yet when examined through the lens of long-term system dynamics, comfortably spent environments often produce the opposite effect, not through dramatic failure, but through continuous allocation of resources toward maintaining short-term ease at the expense of long-term flexibility. At the surface level, being comfortably spent feels like equilibrium, where income and expenses appear aligned, and daily life maintains a sense of predictability. But underneath that balance, the system is often operating with minimal remaining margin, meaning that most available resources are already committed to sustaining existing habits and consumption patterns. Psychologically, this state is reinforced because comfort reduces friction, and reduced friction increases repetition. So the same categories of spending tend to reappear without reevaluation, gradually transforming optional expenses into perceived necessities simply through consistency rather than actual requirement. Over time, this creates a subtle but important shift in financial structure, where the distinction between what is needed and what is habitual begins to blur. And as that blur increases, the system begins to prioritize maintenance of lifestyle consistency over the accumulation of unallocated resources. Mathematically, even small recurring allocations, when distributed across multiple categories of daily comfort, form a persistent baseline outflow that reduces the available capacity for deviation. And it is this reduced capacity, not any single expense, that defines the constraint. As income grows within such a structure, the expansion is often absorbed proportionally by the same comfort-based categories, a process commonly described as lifestyle alignment, but more precisely understood as proportional absorption, where increased resources are redistributed into existing patterns rather than creating new structural flexibility. This mechanism becomes more visible when viewed over longer time horizons, because while individual expenses appear minor in isolation, their repeated presence creates a cumulative system that defines the boundaries of financial behavior, effectively setting an upper limit on how much flexibility can exist at any given time. In behavioral terms, comfort reduces the perceived need for adjustment, which delays the recognition of structural inefficiency, and by the time pressure is felt, the system has often already stabilized around a high consumption baseline that is difficult to shift without intentional disruption. From a systemic perspective, this is not inherently negative, because comfort itself is a valid use of resources, but the critical distinction lies in whether that comfort is periodically reevaluated against long-term objectives or simply allowed to expand passively with income over time. When no reevaluation occurs, the financial system begins to operate like a closed loop, where inputs and outputs remain balanced but directional change is limited, resulting in stability without progression, which is often mistaken for financial health. However, when even small adjustments are introduced into this loop, such as reducing friction-based spending or redirecting marginal expenses, the system begins to develop slack, and slack is what allows financial decisions to become strategic rather than purely reactive. This slack is not immediately visible in daily life, but it becomes significant over time because it introduces optionality, and optionality is the underlying condition required for any meaningful shift in financial trajectory, whether through investment, saving, or structural change in consumption patterns. In this sense, the true cost of being comfortably spent is not measured in what is actively spent, but in what is never allowed to accumulate, because accumulation requires space, and comfort-driven systems often eliminate that space without noticing it. At a broader behavioral level, this explains why many individuals feel financially stable yet simultaneously constrained, as the system provides continuity of lifestyle but restricts expansion of possibility, creating a paradox where stability and limitation coexist within the same structure. Historically, similar patterns can be observed in systems where efficiency and convenience were optimized without maintaining buffer capacity, leading to environments that function smoothly under normal conditions but lack resilience when external variables shift. This comparison highlights an important principle in financial mechanics. Stability is not equivalent to flexibility, and a system can remain perfectly stable while gradually reducing its ability to adapt, depending on how surplus capacity is managed. As awareness of this structure increases, financial behavior begins to shift from passive maintenance toward intentional design, where each category of spending is periodically assessed not only for its immediate value, but for its role in the broader system of allocation and opportunity. Over time, this shift does not require reducing comfort entirely, but rather redefining its role within a system that preserves margin, allowing comfort to exist without consuming the entire structure that supports future decisions. When that balance is achieved, even gradually, the financial system transitions from a closed loop into a more open structure, where resources circulate with intentional direction rather than automatic absorption, and it is within that openness that long-term flexibility naturally emerges. In this way, the cost of being comfortably spent is not a single financial burden, but a systemic condition that determines whether resources remain fixed in place or are allowed to evolve into future capacity. And understanding that distinction is what ultimately reframes how everyday spending is interpreted within a larger economic context. Continuing from that point, it becomes important to recognize that systems built around comfort do not typically collapse suddenly, but instead adjust themselves to maintain equilibrium, which means that even when inefficiencies begin to accumulate, the system often compensates internally by reducing volatility elsewhere, creating the appearance of continued stability while quietly narrowing future flexibility. This compensatory behavior is subtle because it does not feel like loss in real time. Instead, it feels like consistency, where life continues to function smoothly, expenses are met, and routines remain intact. Yet beneath that surface, the range of possible future adjustments becomes progressively smaller, which is the key structural change that often goes unnoticed. As this narrowing continues, decision-making begins to shift in tone, not because choices disappear, but because the acceptable range of choices becomes more constrained by prior commitments. And over time, this leads to a situation where financial decisions are increasingly made within pre-existing boundaries rather than redefining those boundaries themselves. From a systems perspective, this can be understood as a reduction in degrees of freedom, meaning the system still operates, but with fewer independent variables available for change. And once degrees of freedom are reduced, even small disruptions can have disproportionate effects because there is less buffer to absorb them. At this stage, comfort is no longer just a lifestyle condition. It becomes an organizing principle, where spending patterns, time allocation, and even behavioral expectations are aligned around maintaining the current structure rather than expanding it, and this alignment reinforces itself through repetition. Mathematically, what is occurring can be described as a gradual convergence toward equilibrium without expansion, where inflows and outflows remain balanced, but the capacity for surplus generation diminishes, and in such a system, growth requires intentional deviation from equilibrium rather than passive continuation of it. This is where the role of awareness becomes structurally important, because without recognizing the existence of this convergence, the system continues to optimize for comfort within a shrinking set of possibilities, which reinforces the very constraints that define it. Once awareness is introduced, even minimally, the system begins to allow for segmentation of expenses, separating those that maintain essential stability from those that exist primarily due to habit or convenience. And this distinction is critical because it introduces the possibility of reallocation without destabilization. Reallocation, in this context, does not imply reduction for its own sake, but rather the deliberate restructuring of flow so that not all resources are continuously absorbed by maintaining existing patterns, which allows a portion of capacity to remain unassigned and therefore available for future. That unassigned capacity is what creates what can be described as structural slack, and structural slack is the foundation upon which adaptability is built, because it ensures that not every resource is locked into predetermined function, allowing the system to respond to change without immediate constraint. As structural slack increases, even slightly, the behavior of the system begins to change in measurable ways, not because income has increased, but because allocation has become less rigid, and this reduced rigidity allows for gradual exploration of alternative financial paths that were previously inaccessible. Over longer periods, this introduces a divergence between systems that remain fully allocated and systems that maintain partial flexibility, and that divergence is what eventually determines whether financial behavior remains static or begins to evolve. In practical terms, This means that the difference between stagnation and progression is not defined by dramatic financial events, but by whether the system allows itself to maintain unused capacity, even in small and seemingly insignificant amounts, because unused capacity is what enables future movement. This also reframes the role of discipline, not as restriction, but as structure maintenance, where the goal is not to eliminate comfort, but to ensure that comfort does not fully occupy the system's total available capacity, leaving no room for adjustment or expansion. As this structure stabilizes, financial behavior becomes less reactive and more architectural, meaning that decisions are made with consideration of how they influence the overall design of the system rather than simply addressing immediate needs. And this shift fundamentally alters the trajectory of financial outcomes over time. Eventually, what emerges is a system that still supports comfort, but no longer depends on it exclusively, allowing comfort to exist as one component among many rather than the defining constraint of the entire structure. And this rebalancing is what restores long-term flexibility without requiring abrupt change. In this state, financial progression becomes less about overcoming limitation and more about maintaining intentional structure over time, where each decision contributes to either preserving or expanding available capacity. And it is this ongoing calibration that ultimately determines whether the system continues to evolve or settles into a stable but closed loop. At a deeper level, this ongoing calibration also reveals something more fundamental about how financial systems behave over time, which is that they tend to drift toward whatever requires the least cognitive effort to maintain, meaning that without periodic intervention, the system naturally organizes itself around convenience, repetition, and predictability rather than efficiency or expansion. This drift is not a failure of discipline in the traditional sense, but rather an expression of energy minimization, where both human behavior and financial structures tend to prefer the path of least resistance. And once that path is established, it becomes self-reinforcing because each repetition reduces the perceived cost of continuing it. In that sense, comfort is not just a condition of spending, but a stabilization force within the system. And like all stabilization forces, it resists change by design, not through active opposition, but through inertia, which makes deviation feel more costly than continuation even when the long-term benefits of deviation are significant. This is why meaningful financial adjustment rarely comes from single decisions, but instead from sustained structural awareness, because isolated changes are quickly absorbed back into the existing pattern unless they are reinforced by a consistent shift in how decisions are evaluated and executed. When evaluation begins to include not just immediate utility, but also structural impact, each expense becomes part of a larger map of allocation, and this mapping process gradually alters how value is perceived, shifting it away from immediacy and toward cumulative effect over time. As this shift develops, the system begins to distinguish more clearly between expenditure that maintains function and expenditure that defines direction, and this distinction is crucial because direction, unlike function, determines how the system evolves rather than simply how it operates in the present moment. From a mathematical standpoint, this can be understood as a transition from a static allocation model to a dynamic allocation model, where resources are not simply distributed to meet ongoing needs, but are periodically reassigned to maintain optionality and prevent full saturation of available capacity. Optionality, in this context, becomes a key variable because it represents the system's ability to respond to unknown future conditions without requiring immediate restructuring. And systems that preserve optionality tend to exhibit greater long-term adaptability even when short-term efficiency appears lower. This introduces an important tension between optimization and resilience, because optimizing fully for comfort or efficiency in the present often reduces resilience in the future, while preserving some level of unallocated capacity may appear inefficient in the short term, but supports greater stability under changing conditions. Over time, understanding this trade-off changes how small expenses are interpreted, because they are no longer viewed in isolation, but as part of a broader allocation strategy that either preserves or reduces systemic flexibility depending on how consistently they are allowed to accumulate. At the behavioral level, this understanding gradually reduces automaticity, meaning that fewer decisions are made purely out of habit, and more decisions pass through a brief moment of structural consideration, where their role in the larger system is implicitly or explicitly evaluated. This does not require constant analysis or mental effort for every transaction, but rather the development of a baseline awareness that influences decision-making in the background, subtly reshaping patterns without introducing friction into daily life. As this baseline stabilizes, the system begins to show signs of self-correction, where excessive accumulation of low-value repetition naturally slows, not through restriction, but through reclassification of what is considered necessary versus incidental within the structure of spending. In this phase, financial behavior starts to resemble a layered system rather than a flat sequence of choices, with different categories of spending operating at different levels of priority, responsiveness, and review frequency, which introduces a more nuanced form of control that is distributed rather than centralized. This distributed control is what allows the system to remain both flexible and stable, because it avoids overcorrecting in any single direction, instead maintaining balance through continuous small adjustments that preserve overall structure while allowing. Eventually, the distinction between comfort and constraint becomes less absolute and more contextual, meaning that comfort is no longer inherently limiting, but only limiting when it occupies the entire capacity of the system without leaving space for adjustment or reallocation. And when that understanding is fully integrated, financial behavior transitions from being reactive to being structurally intentional, where even the smallest decisions are understood as part of an ongoing design process rather than isolated events. And it is within that design process that long-term adaptability is actually made.